Today's public hearing is going to begin. We will be focused on various calls for the amendments to the United States Constitution by using a previously unused section of Article 5, which allows states the ability to recommend changes. Given the change in the Senate session today, ladies and gentlemen, our session has been moved up to 10 o'clock. So both our time today and the number of senators who will be able to join us is going to be very limited, and I apologize for that, but was this the nature of the beast. Also, there were those who called my office demanding the hearing to be canceled, but please rest easy. Today is a public hearing only. There is no votes at this time on any of the resolutions being discussed this morning. And as I believe all matters referred to the Senate State Government Committee should be given due diligence and consideration, and the best way to accomplish this goal is to publicly discuss the matters referred to us. Public discussion is never bad, and if and when these proposals are voted, there will be ample advance notice. Even if we were able to vote and approve all of the resolutions before us today, there is no way they could have been advanced because they are concurrent resolutions, they require approval of both the Senate and the House, and given the lack of session days remaining in 2017-2018 legislative session, there is no way that any of them could be approved by either chamber, let alone by both. An ongoing debate in our nation is the question of whether the rule of law is a living constitution or one that should be taken literally. The former says the Constitution was intentionally written in a broad and flexible terms so as to change with the times, while the latter focuses on the original words, meaning and intent of the Constitution. While I'm sure not everyone will agree, I support George Washington, who said in his farewell address of 1796, and I quote, "If, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates." President Washington went on to add, "But let there be no change by usurpation, for though this in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is in the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. The president must always be greatly overbalanced in permanent evil, any partial or transient benefit which the use can at any time yield." I agree. If we fail to follow the Constitution, it becomes a mere words on paper. However, when we adhere to the Constitution and amend rather than interpret it, it remains our rule of law. Today, we ask others if they agree or disagree. And if they agree, is an Article 5 Convention of States the best way to proceed? With this as background, I will yield to, but no, I don't believe Senator Williams is here. So, given the volume of the time frame that we're in and the volume of the testimony that needs to be heard, we're going to call up the first testifiers. And those who will be testifying, I will ask, and I apologize for this, to try to summarize your statements. And again, ladies and gentlemen, let's conduct this in an orderly fashion, as our founders, I think, would want us to, in respect of the rule of law. And let us allow these comments by whoever to be heard. Again, this is just a hearing. This is for information gathering and such. So, without further ado,
Senator Brown has some comments. And Senator Costa as well.
Well, you know what? I spoke too soon. I have two senators that would like to have some comments, and I'm going to yield to Senator Costa.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this discussion today. I think it's very important that as we go through this process that we have these conversations and understand and appreciate the concerns that folks may have and appreciate how important it is to have this dialogue. One of the resolutions that we'll be discussing today, Senate Resolution 254, I think My intent along those lines was to address what I think was an inappropriate decision by our Supreme Court with respect to impacting our campaign finance laws in this Commonwealth. I think that at the end of the day, we need to have a significant amount of transparency, particularly in this area of election time when we're dealing with many issues along those lines. The goal would be to have this create an environment where people understand and appreciate where these resources are coming, and that we should not have unlimited resources put into play along those lines. This is consistent with the work that I've been trying to do here in Pennsylvania with respect to campaign election or campaign finance limits in Pennsylvania. We've not gotten much steam on that particular piece of legislation, but these are concerns that my caucus and I have about how we conduct ourselves along those lines. So I'm going to be staying for a short period of time, Mr. Chairman. As you indicated, we're going in soon, early. And I got to run back upstairs to address a number of the legislative issues that are hot topic issues for today as well. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Costa. And I'm going to turn over to Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to be prime sponsor of Senate Resolution 254, along with Senator Costa, to provide for a real activist place by this government in relation to what is a very significant issue on the minds of the people of Pennsylvania and, frankly, citizens around the country. We all know that direct citizen engagement is the best means on which to pursue an informed election process. In 24 years in office, I believe that having a common sense campaign finance reform is the best way for not only Pennsylvania, but states around the country to have better balance between what we see as the paid media components of a campaign and the individual actions of citizens to have a real balanced process in elections. A process like this will also explore something that's absolutely necessary in fair elections, and that is having the maximum, most effective system of transparency. And working with my colleagues on this committee and throughout state government, I believe, along with all the people who are actively engaged in taking a serious look at this being an option for us for responsible campaign finance reform, will be able to develop a system that is in the best interest of our democratic system and all the citizens of the Commonwealth. And I want to thank the chairman for conducting this hearing today.
Thank you very much, Senator Brown. We will begin with a video from former U.S. Senator Jim DeMint, who has collaborated with his colleague, former U.S. Senator Tom Coburn, who was originally scheduled to be with us today but had to cancel due to a reoccurring health issue. But we do appreciate the opportunity to hear them from video, and just look at your screens and we'll start that way.
Hello, this is former Senator Jim DeMint. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. I apologize for not being there in person. I have submitted a written statement for the record, but I'd just like to talk a little bit informally. I spent a little time in Pennsylvania last year talking to some of you about this idea of convention of states. I'd just like to follow up a little bit today. And I know this is a special courtesy to do a video in a hearing. I've sat through a lot of hearings myself in the House and the Senate, so I especially appreciate this courtesy. After serving for 14 years in the House and the Senate, I can tell you definitively without any hesitation that Washington is broken. I'm sure if you've been watching what's been going on in Washington the last few years, particularly the last few weeks in the hearings for the court, you have to ask yourself, what's the problem? It's not just about partisanship. The reason there was such a fight about one seat on the court was that so much power has shifted to Washington over many, many decades that now every court seat, every Senate seat, every House seat holds so much power over all the American people that more and more of the big special interest money is going into every race. And it doesn't supposed to be that way. as you all know, being in Pennsylvania, it wasn't too long ago when our founders sat there and argued about giving the federal government any power at all. Their biggest concern was that the federal government would get too big and too powerful and supersede the power of the states. So it was set up in the beginning with the states having a lot of power. The Constitution set up to limit what the federal government could do, primarily for defense purposes, but just to make sure that commerce between the states ran. And you all know the 10th Amendment, that whatever was not listed specifically in the Supreme Court was left to the states. And the states set it up so that they could keep the federal government accountable. As you know, in the beginning, the state legislators appointed the U.S. senators. And that was for the purpose of making sure that the federal government stayed within those guidelines of the Constitution. And they also gave the states Article 5 of the Constitution. If the federal government got out of control, the states could come together and propose amendments to limit what the federal government was doing. And so we can amend the Constitution two ways. Congress, every day that it meets, can propose an amendment. And states can come together and meet and propose an amendment. But the check and balance after that is that 38 states have to ratify it, regardless of whether Congress proposes the amendment or whether states propose the amendment. That gives me a lot of comfort. Not that Congress can recommend amendments. So frankly, after being there, that's somewhat scary. But the fact that 38 states have to ratify. Unfortunately, I guess, that the Constitution has now been amended that the state legislators do not appoint U.S. senators. I now realize the wisdom of that in the beginning, and we can probably never take that popular vote away from people again. But it gave the U.S. Senate a specific accountability to the states. We've lost that, but we still have Article 5. And I am just suggesting and pleading with you that I know you've got a lot of serious Pennsylvania business to do, but we need the states to reassert themselves in keeping the federal government accountable. The federal government has got so much power now that it is involved in all aspects of our lives. I mean, from the gas we put in our car to the fertilizer we put on our lawns. They're trying to run our healthcare system, our schools, our whole transportation system. And over the years, they've put enough money in each of these areas to effectively bribe the states to give up more and more control so that the federal government is regulating more and more. We need a federal government, but we need a strong federation of states who are trying to develop their own best practices of how to run schools, how to do the healthcare system, to work together on things. I'm just convinced, again, that we need the states to come together and propose amendments to restore the original limits on the Constitution. I don't think we need to change it. We need to restore those original limits. And I hope you've had someone talk to you about the details of the Convention of States. The reason we haven't had one to date is you have to have 34 states to agree in advance on the agenda. They can't just come together and propose all kinds of amendments. They have to agree on what those amendments are going to be or the subject matter of those amendments. And our goal is to get the states to come together now and to propose amendments in 3 subject areas. One is to limit the federal government fiscally. The federal government needs to have a balanced budget requirements. But even more than that, it needs to limit its authority because we'll never balance the budget if the federal government continues to try to be involved and to fund all aspects of our lives. A lot of those tax dollars need to shift back to the states so states can make more decisions. And as part of that first subject matter of limiting the federal government fiscally, We need to limit spending. We need to limit taxes in a way that just forcing a balanced budget does not result in higher taxes. So that is one subject matter area. We also need the federal government to come together, as I mentioned, to limit the authority and jurisdiction of the federal government. Just clarifying the Commerce Clause, which once just meant regulating the trade between states, has now been opened up by judicial precedent in a way that allows the federal government to regulate effectively everything. There are no enumerated powers now. The 10th Amendment has no relevance anymore. We need to limit the authority and jurisdiction of the states. The third subject matter area is to limit the terms of federal officials. I've been there. I limited my own term. I can tell you there are not too many people who've been there over 10 years who are still fighting for those limits that they campaigned on in both parties. And again, this is not a partisan matter. I'm sure there are Democrats and Republicans listening to what I'm saying today, but I'm convinced that you could work it out better at the state level and to do things that are best for Pennsylvania. And that by doing things that are best for Pennsylvania, you will challenge the states around you to do what's best for their states. And we will have the laboratories of democracy that our founders intended in the first place. The limits on terms of federal officials not only include members of Congress, but it could include their staff. It could include judges. It could include the unelected bureaucrats who make so many of the laws that we live by today. So again, thank you for allowing me a little time to plead with you to help us save this country. It really is that serious. Washington will not fix itself. If you looked at the Kavanaugh hearings, you can see that the parties are polar opposite now because there's so much power now vested in Washington. We need the states to reassert themselves, to push back against the federal government, and to push them back into the limits that our founders intended in the Constitution. And I hope as you go about all the other business that you have to deal with, that you will remember that the states are the ones that our founders intended to hold the federal government accountable, and we need you now. Thanks again. I hope to see you again soon in Pennsylvania, and goodbye.
With Senator DeMint's video as background, we'll now move to our in-person testifiers, beginning with Mr. Mark Meckler, President of the Citizens for Self-Government and the Convention of States Project. Mr. Meckler, please have a seat, and please make sure your green light is on. And welcome, by the way.
Thank you.
And I will ask you again, and I apologize for this, but could you summarize your testimony as we can keep this thing moving? Thank you very much. Feel free when you're ready. Make sure your green light's on.
It is.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee, members of the audience, it is a great privilege and honor for me to be here in the Pennsylvania legislature. I have the opportunity to travel legislatures all over the country, having been in 44 of them over the last 2 years. And first, I have to compliment you on the building, one of the most beautiful in the country for sure, certainly one of the most historic. And I think that's an important place to begin my testimony because in regard to the subject of Article 5, there is no more historic place in the United States of America than the great state of Pennsylvania. The Constitution itself birthed in this great state. The very idea of Article 5 created in this state. On September 15, 1787, at the Constitutional Convention, merely 2 days before the end of the convention, Colonel George Mason from Virginia stood and addressed the assembly. He said something I think that is incredibly important. He noted that in that incredible document, that beautiful document, our national charter, was a grave mistake. He noted that we had given the power to Congress to propose amendments should they deem them necessary, but that we'd not given the same power to the people acting through the states. And he asked a question which I believe resonates over these 230 plus years. He asked the men assembled if they were so naive that they believed that a government that became a tyranny would ever propose amendments to restrain their own tyranny. Now, I imagine they laughed when that question was asked. Unfortunately, we don't have video of that event. We do have Madison's notes, which are pretty close to video. He was a very good note taker. Madison's notes reflect debate about almost everything at the Constitutional Convention. But on this issue, they are unbelievably short. 2 short Latin words read nin com, no comment, no debate. In other words, the men assembled found that proposition so obvious that the states would have to restrain the federal government that they did not debate the issue. And unbelievably, unanimously, they adopted the second clause of Article 5, giving us, the people, the power to act through you, our state legislators, to call a convention specifically for the purpose of restraining federal tyranny. I don't believe there's any debate today in the United States of America whether we live under federal tyranny or not. Regardless of party affiliation, Americans say, 72% of them, as a matter of fact, as of the latest polling, that the federal government is too big and does too much. It is too deeply involved in our lives, and this was not the intent of the founders, nor, frankly, has it been the intent of Americans ever since. We have lost the constitutional limitations by, as Senator Fulmer discussed, usurpation, by accretion, by decision of the Supreme Court, by actions of Congress and presidents, unopposed, unfortunately, by the states. Today, you'll hear many people say if we could only enforce the Constitution, everything would be okay. If they would just follow the Constitution as written, everything would be okay. And there are probably many people in this audience today, maybe some of the honorable members of this committee, that are carrying pocket constitutions with them. And if that were our Constitution today, I would say that that statement would be correct. Unfortunately, if you believe that's our Constitution, I would tell you that you're incorrect. I would challenge you to order a United States Constitution from the government printing office. It's about $130, believe it or not, and you can get it, and it will arrive at your office in a heavy cardboard box because it is over 2,700 pages today. It weighs approximately 10 pounds with all the supplements, and that on the spine says the Constitution of the United States of America. Most of us are stunned to find out that that's what the federal government considers the Constitution to be. It contains every case ever issued by the Supreme Court, cases which apparently are necessary to tell us what that beautiful, simple document means, or because they believe that we are so simple we can't understand that document. Today, what we're here to do and why we're attempting to call an Article 5 Convention of States is because we believe in the original Constitution with the Bill of Rights. We believe that that was the document that was intended to govern this nation, and we believe that that document has been greatly altered, often to the discredit of the United States Supreme Court and often to the detriment of the rights of the American people over this last specifically and especially 115 years. So today our goal is to call a convention of states. Now you're going to hear a lot of testimony following me about why this is such a problem. And I'd like to address some of that in advance because I won't have a chance to do that afterwards. And so the main argument that you're going to hear is one that is particularly offensive to me being here in Pennsylvania. And it is a grave slander against the founders of the United States of America. The great framers that appeared at that convention and spent months in that convention debating and discussing and approving this incredible document apparently were men who lacked honor. This is the argument that will be made. It's a grave slander because what it will be said is that they ran away in that convention. They ignored the instructions they were given by their states. They ignored the limitations that were put on them. I want you to imagine that time when honor was so important that these men would simply ignore the instructions given to them by their state legislatures. It's an outrageous and slanderous allegation, and in fact, it is completely untrue. It is provably untrue, and I would encourage you to read the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy article by Michael Ferris, who's researched that convention more than anybody else in American history, 145-page article definitively refuting the idea that the 1787 convention was a runaway convention. I'd like to put that slander to rest and defend the honor of the founders, including the great Pennsylvanian Dr. Benjamin Franklin. You will also hear slander issued towards our organization. And I would argue that the type of slander that you're going to hear is essentially a Kavanaughing. People are trying to associate us with other organizations. They're making outrageous allegations about our funding with zero evidence. This kind of slander should not be part of American political discourse. You've received emails from organizations that oppose us, making all sorts of slanderous allegations about our organization. I'm not even going to address them because they're so outrageous and offensive and without any proof that they do not require addressing. I'll close my remarks with this and then open for questions. We are in the birthplace of American liberty. It is truly an incredible honor, one of my greatest honors of my political career, to sit in this legislature and offer testimony in a place where some of the greatest Americans ever to have lived have been. This is the one state that should be leading the way. This is the state where Article 5 was actually invented, the second clause, the first clause of Article 5, where the whole Constitution was put together. The question is today, will we use the Constitution to save the Constitution, or do we lack the courage to do so? This nation was founded by men of courage, by families of courage, by women of courage, not by people who cowered in fear. The primary argument that I hear against this idea is an argument based in fear. You will hear the words, I fear, I'm afraid, I'm worried about, I'm concerned, I'm scared. Those were not words used by our founders. That's not the stance of our founders. This country was founded by courageous people. It has been rescued in the darkest times by the most courageous of our people. And today, in my opinion, some of the most courageous people in the nation are standing to call an Article 5 convention. And I hope and ask and pray that the Pennsylvania legislature will lead the way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to defer to two of my colleagues before my questions for you, sir. First, Senator Allaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mark, thank you for being here. Every time I hear you, I'm more amazed. I mean, I first met Mark and Senator Coburn and Senator DeMint a couple years ago, sat in on a seminar and listened to what they had to say. And I got to tell you, when I first went in, I was like, all right, what's this about? You know, I'm wanting to listen and learn. And at the end of it, I'm convinced beyond any measure that this is the right thing to do. Everything that you two gentlemen have said this morning is the gospel. If you think Washington is going to fix itself, there is no way. And I've been in state government for 10 years, and long before that, I've always believed in federalism. I've always been a states' rights guy. I just always felt like the states should take care of their own issues, and if someone wants to do something different, that's fine. I live here in Pennsylvania, and I've just always believed that. And when I look and I see, I'm a lawyer as well, and I'm a former judge, and when I see the same things that you talk about, I've seen it. I've witnessed it, just the degradation of our Constitution, our laws, and this is the only way to do it. And so to me, it seems just absolutely painfully obvious. It's like they put this in here for this reason, because they foresaw this huge, monstrous power potentially growing because of the faults of men in general. And this is what they gave us to step in and take it back. And you're 100% right. Every person that I've talked to, everything is fear. It's fear of the unknown. And I understand that. I understand that. But as you said, we have to be courageous and take this step and take our government back. We have to. This is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This is an out-of-control government, as Jim said, that it's so powerful now down there. They spend tens of millions of dollars to get this piece of power because of what it means to them. And it shouldn't be that way. So thank you for everything that you've done. Unfortunately, I got to get up and I got some other meetings as well. But thank you for coming here. Look forward to keeping in touch. And look, for those of you that may have a different opinion, I respect you. And I want to hear your opinion, and I want to keep this dialogue. I'm the one that asked Senator Fulmer to have this meeting because I want to have this dialogue among the men and women and families of this Commonwealth and talk about what we can do to take our government back. So, Mark, thank you.
Senator Pat Brown. Senator Pat Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mark, thank you for your leadership on this. Really appreciate your historical perspective. The way that you described the thought process of the Founding Fathers and why this was important is right on point. The one thing I'm curious, though, from your perspective, given what this country's been through, all the challenges we've been through, the differences that the federal government and its position in relation to the states now as opposed to where it was when it started, why has this never happened? in your perspective? Why isn't Article 5 amendment, given all the changes and all the challenges we've had, it's never been successful in the past? What is your thought process on that?
Senator, I think that's a great question. I think the first reason that I would say it's never happened is because it's very difficult. And I think that's intentional. The founders set an incredibly high bar. They did not, and they wrote about this, they did not want the Constitution changed based on changing societal whims. They wanted it to be an arduous process that required the development of consensus across all of the states, 3/4, 2/3 to call and 3/4 to ratify. A super majority. You guys know how difficult that is in a single legislature. So across the country, it's incredibly difficult. So one is that the bar is simply very high. Number two is it's a very, what I would describe as muscular political exercise. It requires the organizing of grassroots in all 50 states, and nobody has ever attempted it in that way. There have been over 400 applications made for a convention of states to Congress. None of them have, or they haven't aggregated enough to get to the 34 because nobody's organized the operation. And so this was our approach, to take a political grassroots organizing approach from the start to organize in all 50 states. So we started that 5 years ago. Today there are 3.6 million supporters in the field. We have supporters in 100% of all state legislative districts in the nation. We have just here in the Commonwealth, over 40,000 supporters have expressed their support through petitions. So I think the real answer is just it's very difficult. It requires an organized, difficult, arduous, expensive effort, and we're the first organization ever to undertake that nationally.
Well, you described the probably the most important component of this is and that's the reason why I believe that the focus of this is important, and that's campaign finance reform. And it's going to take direct citizen engagement, and that's something we need more of in elections. So this would provide a dual benefit to that, is have what's necessary to get an amendment done, which is the only way to get it done is that for more people to engage in the process. But if you're looking for someone to take on a challenge, you couldn't find anyone better than Senator Fulmer. So he is the man who can do it. So thank you for your efforts. It's very important.
Senator.
Well, Pat, I don't know about that. But anyway, Mark, thanks for being here. And due to Senator Corburn's health issues, means I just have more questions for you. Let us begin and such. Given the history of the 1787 Constitutional Convention, and the shrill political divisions and debates of our day, how would a 2018 Constitutional Convention differ from the 1787 Convention, where, for instance, two of the New York delegates, John Lansing and Robert Yates, left Philadelphia in protest of the deliberations, which allowed one person, Alexander Hamilton, to act and vote on behalf of the entire state of New York?
I'll deal with the New York situation first. I actually think it's great that those guys left. And the reason I think it's great is they were one of the only two delegations that did not have full authority at that convention.
Right.
And I think this is really interesting because we hear the argument these guys didn't have authority. If you read the commissions of the delegates to the convention, all of them had authority to take any and all action necessary to render the federal Constitution adequate for the exigencies of the Union. They were not there to simply amend the Articles of Confederation. New York is an exception to that. So when the two of them left, I think that was important and actually appropriate under the circumstances. And ultimately, they did not vote on the Constitution in its final form and did not sign the Constitution because they did not have authority. I think the fundamental difference between that convention, there'll be a lot of them, but I think the fundamental difference between 1787 and today is the public nature of the convention. 1787, as we all know the story, the men locked themselves in Independence Hall, boarded up the windows, had a sweltering summer. You guys have pretty good air conditioning here. It would probably be okay wherever they are.
I could never imagine that.
No, hard to imagine. And months in that building, in private. I've had a lot of people say to me, well, this one won't be able to be in private, and so that's a problem. I say, thank God it won't be able to be in private. I'm a big fan of transparency. I think things are different today. We need to know who's in there, who's doing the influencing, who's talking. This thing will be broadcast 24/7 on C-SPAN and every network in the nation. You and I and every school child will have the opportunity to watch and know exactly what's going on. I think that will be the fundamental difference. This will be a public event of great import.
Well, thank you. What if the Convention of States followed the example of the 1787 Convention and changed the ratification process, meaning this? 1787 delegates changed ratifications from all 13 states to the ratification by 9 states. What if the 2018 Convention of States decided any proposed changes to the concurrent Constitution could be ratified by a simple majority of, let's say, 26, rather than the existing requirement of 38 states, which would be 3/4 of the states?
Right. Well, so first of all, I want to address what I think is a historic inaccuracy. The convention itself did not change the method of ratification. In 1787, the same as today, all they had the authority to do was make a recommendation. And then that change was ratified essentially by Congress and then by the states themselves holding convention. So this is really important, and it is a very important distinction. In other words, the convention has no actual power. In 1787, they had no power. And this convention will have no actual power other than to make recommendations. So I think that's number one. Number two is the Convention of States application is structured in such a way that such an amendment would not be available. In other words, it would not even be germane. It could not be discussed at convention. The reason for that is the only thing that's available to the delegates at convention are the 3 subject matter areas: fiscal limitations on the federal government, scope and power jurisdiction limitations on the federal government, and term limits. So any discussion would be non-germane, and any delegate at that convention, any commissioner, could simply raise their hand and raise a point of order, and that would not be discussed at convention.
Okay. Now, after we announced the scheduling of this hearing, my office was inundated with messages from people who said, and I'm going to quote, "I'm a volunteer. I care about our Constitution. Here are the reasons why Pennsylvania legislators should defeat all applications for Article 5 convention," and they quoted former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Scalia. And I quote his statement, "I certainly would not want a constitutional convention. Whoa, who knows what would come out of it?" That was on April 14th, 2014 quote. How should we reply to such concerns?
Number one, this is one of my favorite discussions and debates, because the assumption of people who make that argument, Senator, is that I think one of the greatest ever jurists in the history of the United States Supreme Court did not understand the difference between a constitutional convention and an Article 5 convention. He was obviously a lawyer first, and any lawyer can tell you that a constitutional convention is what's called in legal terms a plenipotentiary convention, meaning it is an all-powerful convention. It starts from scratch. It's drafting a constitution. It is not drafting amendments to a constitution. So the idea that Antonin Scalia would be so loose with his words and lack such an understanding of basic American tenets of constitutional law as to call an amendments convention a constitutional convention is outrageous. How do we know this for sure? Because you can look at Antonin Scalia's remarks over his lifetime, and he has extensive remarks that he is generally in favor of the idea of an amending convention. He states that he believes there is a very small risk, but that it is absolutely necessary if we are to save our republic. So Justice Scalia well understood the difference between a constitutional convention and an amending convention. And I would say, for the record here openly, I and everybody who is a part of the Convention of States project is adamantly opposed to the idea of a constitutional convention.
A 2016 presidential candidate recently said in a television interview, "You cannot be civil with a political party that wants to destroy what you stand for, what you care about." Now, with such sharp political divides today, how do you see any real or meaningful discussions of possible amendments to the United States Constitution being productive when we can't even be civil to one another just because we're from different political parties?
Well, I think the idea of civility is at the root of the idea of a convention of states, and this is what I mean by that. I think part of the reason for this radical division in the country, the hatred, the wickedness, the partisanship, is because so many decisions are made in Washington, D.C. right now. What that means is if you have a Democratic administration and a Democratic Congress, half of the country is going to be angry about whatever comes out of that administration. If you have a Republican administration, as we do now, and now a more conservative Supreme Court, you're going to make half of the country angry for whatever comes out. We solve that problem by removing the power from Washington, D.C. and returning it to the states, where we can have these debates and discussions with our neighbors as the founders intended. In a convention itself, I'm not worried about it. I've seen a convention. We held a mock convention in Williamsburg 2 years ago. I watched delegates work together. We had Democrats, we had Republicans. I watched people have these discussions. I actually have great faith in state legislatures. I've traveled around, I've been in 44 of them, I know how you operate, I know that there are many more great statesmen and women in state legislatures than we see in Washington, D.C. today. So we'll get in that convention. I have no doubt it will be cantankerous and difficult. There will be arguments and debates, but I have faith in the American people and state legislators from all over the country to work out our differences.
Excuse me. In 1976, the Pennsylvania General Assembly passed a resolution calling for a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution. What's your position on the federal balanced budget amendment?
I'm a fan generally of the idea of a balanced budget amendment. However, and this is a very big caveat, a balanced budget amendment without other structural restrictions and restraints on the federal government is one of the most dangerous non-federalist ideas available to us today. And here's the reason why. A balanced budget amendment alone would simply say that the federal government must live within its means. What it does not do is prevent the federal government from pushing unfunded mandates on the states. And so today, by the way, and most constituents won't know this, roughly 65% of all state budgets are controlled in one way or another by the federal government. Imagine what that would be like if we pass a balanced budget amendment alone. The federal government is not going to stop imposing programs. They're simply going to make you, as state legislators, tax your citizens for them and have no control. So I am opposed to a balanced budget amendment alone. I am in favor of a balanced budget amendment with other structural restrictions on the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government.
Thank you for that answer. What are your thoughts, if any, on countermand amendment to the United States Constitution, which, if approved, would give states the ability to override federal legislation, executive orders, or court orders whenever 30 states take action to agree to such a vote? Veto, I mean.
So I'm generally in favor of states' abilities to override the federal government. Again, as a standalone amendment, I don't think it solves the problems that ail the nation. As a package of amendments limiting the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government, I do believe the states should ultimately have power in some sort of a supermajority configuration to overrule actions of the federal government, so long as they're consistent with other provisions of the United States Constitution, and specifically the Bill of Rights.
Okay, thank you very much. And that's all my questions for you. I would like to turn it over to Senator John Eichelberger, who is the prime sponsor of two of the resolutions, Resolution 133 and 134. And John would like to, Senator Eichelberger, excuse me, would like to make a couple comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's good to see you again today, Mark. And I have, he's getting it for me, wanted to talk for a minute about my experience at a convention that we had in 2016 in Williamsburg, Virginia. And we had a convention of the states experience for 2 days. We consolidated, there were delegates there from all 50 states. There were 2 from Pennsylvania, and I was one of Pennsylvania's delegates. We went through the process of what an Article 5 convention would be like. We had committees, we had floor debates, we elected officers, we implemented our rules. We went through the whole process in a very consolidated fashion, but it was done very professionally and with a lot of thought. Most of the people that were there, I believe, were either legislators or former legislators from around the country, not everybody, but people that understood the process of coming together and trying to work together to accomplish something. And it was very successful. We didn't have anybody stray from what we thought would be the confines of our rules and where we wanted to go, and we followed the framework of what we're asking for with my resolution that I'm proposing here in Pennsylvania. We're looking at that resolution to call to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and impose term limits on federal officials. So what we had 6 proposals that we started, that we established in Williamsburg, and those 6 are the following: that we would require the states to approve any increase in the national debt. We would impose term limits on Congress. We would limit federal overreach by returning the Commerce Clause to its original meaning. We would limit the power of federal regulators by allowing an easy congressional override. We would require a supermajority to impose federal taxes and repeal the 16th Amendment, which legalized the federal income tax. And lastly, we would give the states, by a 3/5 vote, the power to abrogate any federal law, regulation, or executive order. So those are the 6 things we came up with in 2 days. We could have probably vetted them further. We would have had more time, as a regular convention would have. We had legal staff at our disposal. We worked through a lot of other issues that didn't pass on the final day on the floor. But it was an exercise that I thought was very well done and very helpful. And it showed me and a lot of others that we could do a convention today and it would work. We could come up with ideas that we could bring back to the states. It could change the direction of America in a very good way. We control our government. And I think, and we talked about this a little yesterday, if we had a discussion, if any of us had a discussion with our founding fathers today, and we told them about all the problems that we're suffering through in this great country, they would tell us, what are you doing to correct that? We would say, we complain, we talk to our legislators, and they would say, that's not enough. We gave you Article 5. You can do something about it. Talk to your state, have them do the right thing, and have the people get the power back to control a runaway government in Washington. So thank you for the time this morning.
Thank you, Senator Eichelberger. John and I came in together in 2007, so he's been like a hip buddy of mine for a while. So anyway, sir, you're done. Thank you. And you can return to your seat. Our next testifier will be Mr. Kim Stauffer, from the president of the Firearm Owners Against Crime. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, sir.
Hey, and again, make sure your green light's on. And again, I apologize. Try to summarize and so forth, and so we can have discussion and such. Thank you very much, sir, and welcome. And the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, honorable senators, for having me here today. I really appreciate it. I'm not here to deny that anything that's been been brought up today has identified that there's problems with the federal government. That's not the issue here. It's almost deja vu for me because 1995 I was dealing with Senate Resolution 12, a similar effort here, and it did pass the Senate and failed in the House. What I'm here to do today is to stress the importance of what could possibly go wrong. And in my travels as a United States Marine around the world, the one glowing example of America is our freedoms. And I know there's been a lot of talk today about how this will fix that, and we've got the procedures, and we need to do these things. But we don't talk about what happens if it goes awry. Mr. Chairman, you brought up the part about the meeting in secret and in the original convention. And I think that's a valid concern because when you look at the breakdown of how this works, and since 1995, I've talked to a lot of attorneys who most have grave concerns about this. But they don't believe that a convention or Article 5, whatever you'd like to call it, it's synonymous with each other. They don't believe this is a good idea because it's a Pandora's box, because there are concerns. And if it does go awry, then the forces we have at work in our society today will target those rights because they see that as impediments. We see that in the protests across the country. the moneyed interests that are pushing Congress around. Dr. John Lott talked about how the legislature in D.C. has pushed a great many of the decision-making into the courts because they don't want to make the tough decisions. And I've met with Senator DeMint, I've met with Mr. Meckler, and we see this as a serious concern and a grave concern when it comes to if the convention does go awry, who's going to control it? Chief Justice Warren Burger also stressed those same concerns. And he also talked about a conflict between Congress, which makes the call, and the conventioneers. And the Supreme Court is going to have to make the decisions to intercede at that point. But so what happens? And does our rights suffer? Because we've seen the impact of other countries meddling in our elections. We've seen the impact of moneyed interest. I could mention a few, but I think you all know who I'm talking about. And first on the spit is the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. And we don't see that as a justifiable reason to take that kind of a chance because there hasn't been any, I don't think there's been adequate attention paid to the consequences of this and how do we solve it? How do we stop a convention gone awry? Because I'm a pragmatic man. You've known me since you ran for office, all of you. I look at things not only the good it'll do, but as Lyndon Johnson said, if it's poorly enforced and or poorly implemented, and I've seen our state laws disenfranchise citizens, 148 pages. So I'm not entirely sure who I trust on the right to bear arms anymore with the impact of shall not be questioned at the state level and shall not be infringed at the federal level. So will these policies change? Will we lose the voices of our founding fathers? Because the constitutional law professors I've talked to, when they talk about this issue, they say if it does turn into a full-out constitutional convention, then we lose the impact of all of the founding fathers' statements in legal actions from that point forward, because it will be the conventioneers who are the ones that guide the courts, and it's mere historical anecdote for our founding fathers we have now. So in the long run, I think that we have to pay more attention to the consequences and not the benefits from this, presumed benefits. And with that, Senator, I'll just conclude my remarks with one thing. If the current legislators in elected office aren't listening to the current Constitution, what in God's name makes us believe that they'll listen to a new one or even the new amendments proposed? Thank you, sir.
And thank you very much for your testimony, sir. And I have several questions, but I'll yield if you have any. I do not. Okay. Senator Pat Stefano.
Yes, sir.
Anyway, so I have some. As a strong supporter of the Second Amendment rights, I share your concerns, really, with the many challenges to these rights. At the same time, your concerns with the Constitutional Convention seem to be summarized by the last page of your testimony. And I quote, "Every concern raised by an Article 5 Convention of States can be addressed properly under the current federal constitutional standards and procedures," unquote. How long are you willing to wait for this to happen?
How long am I willing to wait for this to happen? That's a good question. And I'm not entirely sure that those questions, those concerns we have now will be solved by the new process. Okay. So what will happen? What are we prepared to do if it fails? Because there's two sides to every coin. And what I see is going on here is that we have a lot of optimism about this process that'll work, but we don't have a lot of guidance as far as how it's going to be implemented and be effective. Will the current situation get any better? I really believe that it really lies in the hands of the citizens and that we need to educate the citizenry more. Or why are we choosing to pursue this process and not individual targeted amendments? This is what I've talked with Mr. Meckler about. Do we support that sort of function? Absolutely. Absolutely. But opening up the Pandora's box into a world of unknown consequences, it's a concern that we're not willing to accept.
Thank you for that answer, by the way. And I'm asking questions to everybody here who's going to be testifying only because I'm trying to glean information.
Sure.
And we're trying to get information. You expressed concerns for a convention of states that are not properly structured. Are there any guidelines or structures that, if incorporated into a convention of states, that would allow you to be more comfortable with a convention?
That lies in the heart of whether or not the conventioneers can be controlled in any way.
Okay.
If they're totally under their own control, then there's no restrictions or whatsoever that they can't avoid or eliminate or alter. And you brought that up in your questions to Mr. Meckler.
Right.
And I believe that those concerns can't be addressed because of the wide open nature of that. And the outside influences, I have grave concerns about that. This isn't going to be just the conventioneers.
Gotcha. And again, thank you for that answer. Attached to your testimony are a number of letters from various law professors who expressed different concerns with the Constitutional Convention. Now, these letters are dated from like the 1980s, the most recent letter being November of 1991. Don't you think a lot has changed over the last 27 years?
Well, I think from what we've heard from Senator DeMint, he would say that, and it's not been very good either. So, but I would say that the points raised by those law professors and Chief Justice Warren Burger are timeless because they're rooted in the construction of our current Constitution. And sometimes we get lost in the current issues for what really is a historical view of many. And that's why I included them, because they really haven't been part of the public debate on this. And I think we have to give voice to those concerns.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Thank you. Now, my opening remarks, sir, were done before we received prior to your testimony. And nonetheless, I think we agree with one another. There's a difference between a so-called living constitution and our rule of law that should be taken literally. Now, if we agree that we, the people, should focus on the constitutional original words, meaning and intent, how do we get there without falling into Albert Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different result? So what's your recommendation to get us to follow the original intent and purpose of the Constitution?
Would you please clarify that? What is...
I guess the question is this. We agree that the Constitution, this is our rule of law.
Yes.
Okay, and I carry it with me everywhere I go. This is a copy of the Pennsylvania State Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the U.S. Constitution, all in one hand.
Absolutely.
What would be the best way? I understand everything you're saying, sir. I do. Albert Einstein said, if we keep on doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, that's the definition of insanity. It seems like we're in that mold right now. What would be your recommendation to get us from there to get, because your concerns are if we're going to do this convention of states and we don't even follow the original intent of the Constitution, what would be the best way to get us there?
Well, in my testimony, I stress the importance of something that we don't seem to try to do. And that's, let me rephrase. Involved in right to bear arms issues in Pennsylvania's United States constitutions, what I see as a complete lack is an accountability of the courts to deal effectively with criminals. Perhaps we need to go after the legislators that aren't following their oath. Why aren't they held accountable? The accountability is the key problem we have in our country, whether it's Pennsylvania or the nation overall. And if they're not going to follow this Constitution, they're not going to follow a new one or amendments. So in what's been offered through the Convention of the States project and the others, there's 3 others as well, is there's a complete lack of accountability. Me personally, as a man who's defended the country, there's not a lot that scares me. But I can tell you this whole project scares the dickens out of me because we're not holding accountable those that are in elected office. And if it were me, personally, I'd like to see them perp walked out, the ones that violate their oath. Because my friends that died in Vietnam didn't die for any other reason than to protect and defend this nation and our Constitution. And they died, they put their life on the line for this. And there's too much cavalier attitude when a person assumes office and they think that they can just get away with everything. The video just released on Claire McCaskill showing them how she's deceiving the voters. She's an elected official. She's not being held accountable for intentionally deceiving. And how is that going to change the nature of the beast? And it's not. And so I think the way to go forward is we need more accountability for people in elected office.
Okay.
And I'm not pointing my finger at any individual.
Gotcha.
I'm just saying that without that, this is all going to fail, all the changes, and it's going to fail demonstrably terribly. And it's going to be against our freedoms.
Okay. You talked a lot about the outside influences of this, and given these concerns, what are your thoughts on Senate Resolution 254, a specific call for an Article 5 convention to address campaign contributions?
Well, Article 5 has two components.
Right.
Okay, one is a general and the other one is a individual targeted amendment.
Right.
I think that's a great idea. I think targeting, going after outside interests like that is very important because money is it's a disaster and it's a terrible influence. I've seen it, and you know we're a political action committee also. So we have grave concerns for this. And other than targeting it and doing so, I think the people are ready for doing a targeted amendment as well because they don't want to see this any more than we do. I also see that, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Okay.
I apologize.
That's all right. I do it all the time, dude.
I didn't used to do that 30 years ago, but.
Well, I used to say that too, but. Anyway, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hey, in 1976, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Mr. Meckler. The Pennsylvania General Assembly passed a resolution calling for a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution. I'm going to ask you, what is your position on a federal balanced budget amendment?
Well, it's a bit complicated. I've talked to, I have friends who are chief financial officers, and I ask them, we get into discussions. Ideally, I have to work with a balanced budget situation at home. I don't make extreme purchases. Do I think the government should live within its means? Absolutely. However, if you do an amendment like that, does it justify the expenditures up to and including the current amount that they spend? There's a concern about what it's actually going to justify versus what its appropriate expenditures under the Constitution we have now. The Constitution says the expenditures we have now are supposed to be limited. And if it was limited, it'd be about 20% of what we're spending now. Are we willing to live within that means, or is this amendment going to justify spending $4.5 trillion, which is what we're slated to spend? And, or is it going to justify any amount of money that the federal government pulls in? If they pull in $7 trillion, is that balancing the budget, or should they be, because I agree with Mr. Meckler, there's been an awful lot of unfunded mandates pushed down to the states. And that's going to be made only worse. I think that if a balanced budget amendment comes in, depending on how it's structured, it could devastate the states.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Do you support any amendments to the U.S. Constitution? For instance, if yes, what types of amendments, and how do you recommend pursuing these changes?
Well, the first thing we would like to see is a repeal of the 17th Amendment.
Okay. An argument with that one.
It's clear that there were moneyed interests behind that when it was passed. They wanted to take away the control of the states of the U.S. Senate process by the elected officials, and we see that as a major impediment in this country.
Yeah, the founders were pretty smart. I mean, every state had 2 senators,
yes,
regardless of its size, so that everybody had equal representation. Hey, I'm sure I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. During the 2016 presidential election, one of the candidates asked the question, what have you got to lose? Given where our country is today and where it appears to be headed, what do we have to lose by pursuing an Article 5 convention?
The most important thing in my life, my freedom,
Okay.
and the heritage I want to hand on to my granddaughters.
Good answer. And you know what, sir?
Yes,
I'm
sir.
done. Thank you very much for your openness and for your testimony. And again, we're just gathering in information, and I thank you for your points because as we are debating all this, this is all good.
Yes, it is.
All right.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and fellow senators. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the agenda is Andy Schafley from the Pennsylvania Eagle Forum. I have that correct, right?
Yes.
All right. Welcome, sir. And Andy?
You, Chairman Fulmer.
Sure. Oh, make sure your light's green.
Yes.
And if we can, summarize
Yes.
so we can get into some questions. But it looks like I'm the only one going to be asking you. So I'm the Lone Ranger up here right now. But in all defense of my colleagues, we just started session. So I'm on Capitol leave right now. So if you see my seat empty, I'm here with you good people. So
I understand.
Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Fulmer and members of this distinguished committee. I've submitted written testimony on behalf of Pennsylvania Eagle Forum, and I'm here to testify orally against the Article 5 Convention of States resolutions. First, a bit of background about Pennsylvania Eagle Forum. It's been active in this state since at least the year 2000. Its president is here in attendance, Ned Pfeiffer. It's held annual dinners in this state for leading officials for the last 9 consecutive years. And it is strongly against the Convention of States, as I am. I practice law before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit here in Philadelphia. And I'd just like to preface my remarks that Philadelphia, of course, is the birthplace of our Constitution, and we would look to Pennsylvania to be a strong defender of what they wrote in Philadelphia. It's a pretty good document, our Constitution. It's done a fine job in creating the greatest freedom and prosperity in the history of mankind. And here is one of the biggest problems with these Convention of States resolutions, is that it is impossible to limit what an Article 5 convention would do. And I know there have been attempts in the resolution, there have been some good faith attempts to try to limit its scope. The scope cannot be limited. And scholars have said this. Chief Justice of the United States, Warren Burger, said this in a letter to my mother, Phyllis Schlafly, and I've quoted from that in my testimony. He says, quote, "After a convention is convened, it will be too late to stop the convention if we don't like its agenda. A constitutional convention today would be a free-for-all for special interest groups, television coverage, and press speculation." And that's one of the biggest problems. And I know you've tried to limit it, and I know that, Mr. Chairman, you appreciate those concerns, and I support your comments at the beginning of this hearing that you're opposed to a living Constitution, as I am, as many of the people in this room are. But you cannot limit this Constitutional Convention, this Article 5 Convention. I appreciate Mark Meckler schooling Justice Scalia about some theoretical difference between a Constitutional Convention, Article 5 Convention. That's just semantics. There's only one convention that's allowed under the U.S. Constitution. It's a convention that's called by Congress. Congress makes the call. That's what the text says. The most the states can do is apply to Congress, but it's Congress that makes the call, and it'll take over the process with its call, as will the media. I was a little bit alarmed to hear Mr. Meckler say that this will be transparent. This Article 5 convention will have the media all over the place. Well, that's not what our framers thought was a good idea. When they met in Independence Hall, they kept it secret from the media, because I don't think we want the media to have an enormous influence over rewriting our Constitution. We saw the circus of these Kavanaugh hearings. The media got involved and really became a deplorable spectacle, but they were just choosing one justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. Imagine the process if a convention was rewriting our whole Constitution, and we had the media in there, and we had the billionaires in there, and so on. And it's not a Pandora's box that we want to open. Now, my mother Phyllis Schlafly was very much against having an Article 5 convention, and she would testify in humorous ways, and she would say, we don't have George Washington's and Benjamin Franklin's and James Madison's around us today. We don't have them with us anymore. And then she would joke, and I'm very concerned about those who think they are George Washington and James Madison, because we're not. We're not those people. We don't have those great framers. We don't have that period in time where all the attendees of the Constitutional Convention had themselves sacrificed their lives for the freedom in our country. We don't have that today. And now is not the time to open it up to the special interest groups. Now, I was sitting in attendance when Justice Scalia, in one of the last events he did, I guess it was in the last year of his life, he may have done some events after the luncheon I went to. I was sitting there in attendance, and I didn't ask the question. Someone else asked him a question and said, Justice Scalia, what do you think of convening an Article 5 convention? And his answer was, I think it is a, quote, horrible idea, close quote. Now, that's Justice Scalia after he'd sat on the Supreme Court, after he'd been in D.C., after he saw the way things really work. He said, don't go there. And I think most of us in this room greatly respect that justice, and he's given us that warning, don't go there. It's a, quote, horrible idea, close quote. I know many in this room are supporters of the Second Amendment, and with all we've seen, and it came out at the Kavanaugh hearings, I think we'd have to candidly say that if there were an Article 5 convention, probably the first thing they would do is repeal that Second Amendment or dilute it in some way. I think that's pretty much guaranteed, honestly. Now, you look at the resolutions. We've heard Jim DeMint give his little talk. I liked Jim DeMint when he was in the Senate. He left his seat early. Jim DeMint left his Senate seat early. That's not something that needs to happen. You're going to ask me what should be done. Well, one thing should be done is when we elect senators to serve in Congress, they should fill out their term and do the best they can and run through the finish line. He didn't do that. He left his seat early. And he's talking about these general things that an Article 5 Convention of States might do, might limit the power of the federal government. Well, that is so nebulous. That is so broad. You can include anything limiting the power of the federal government. That could be defunding our military. That could be getting rid of border security. It's too vague. Even the limits they've tried to put into these Convention of States resolutions are just too vague. The Constitution is not the problem, Mr. Chairman. I think we would all agree with that. It's not the problem. The problem is people not following it. Well, if the problem is people not following it, changing the Constitution is not going to address the real problem. You change it, and people aren't going to follow the modified Constitution either. Mr. DeMint, and I'll wrap up here quickly, Mr. DeMint said that there's a safeguard of 38 states having to ratify whatever came out of an Article 5 convention. That's not much of a safeguard, is it? If you look at the 17th Amendment and how it was ratified, and there was a big applause here with the comment to repeal the 17th Amendment. Well, that came out of Congress, and that went to 3/4 of the states for them to ratify. And the 3/4 of the states did ratify the 17th Amendment. In fact, they did it in almost record time. And some of those state legislatures ratified the 17th Amendment virtually unanimously. So what happens is when it comes out of the chute, it's a runaway freight train, and there's so much money and media pressure behind whatever comes out of a constitutional convention that it's just going to go flying through the states. There's going to be no way to stop it at that point. So that's not a meaningful safeguard that 3/4 of the states have to ratify. And people point out it may not even be a 3/4 requirement. That could be changed as well. To wrap up so we have time for questions, I note that there's no fiscal note on these resolutions. I think there should be. This could be expensive in having a convention, in dealing with it. It could be very expensive in terms of funds getting cut off from Pennsylvania, and some of the other states that have looked at this said we need a fiscal note on this. And this year, the states have been unanimous in rejecting these Convention of States resolutions. Some estimate it's been 18-0 in states rejecting these resolutions because elected officials, in contrast with the special interest groups who are getting funding from sources that are not disclosed, the elected officials are saying we need to defend the Constitution. This time when there's so much divisiveness in our country, when we're getting people confronted by paid protesters in restaurants, we need to defend our Constitution. And that's what the states are saying around the country. And I would urge Mr. Chairman and members of the Distinguished Committee to defend the Constitution here in Pennsylvania, the birthplace of this marvelous document. Thank you.
Much for your testimony. My first question, and bear with me on my first question, sir, and at the risk of offending, well, actually, there's nobody here to offend. Consider how much government is in our lives today. From the day we're born and receive a government-issued birth certificate until the death certificate is released sometime after we die, time is determined by the National Institute of Standard and Technology. Government, not parents, decide where children go to school using government-established zip codes. Many occupations and functions require government licenses and certifications. When you marry, want to drive, hunt, fish, or get a dog, you need a license. Permits are needed for new construction and renovations, and commodes just don't flush as well since Congress imposed requirements on them. I'm sorry, I had to throw that in there. I'm dealing with kidney stones, so you're going to appreciate it. I could go on, but I think you get my drift here. Given the amount of government involvement or intrusion, depending upon your presuppositional philosophical worldview, what do you believe is the best way to address the size, the scope, and the breadth of our government?
It's an excellent question, Mr. Chairman, and we're on the same side in opposing this overbearing federal government. And the best way to address it is to do better at electing public officials, do better at our elected officials when they get into office, running through the finish line and trying hard to fulfill their term and fulfill their duty. Maybe we need to be more active after we elect the good people. We elect good people. Maybe we need to spend more of our time visiting them and visiting members of this state legislature and being more engaged. I am not as pessimistic as others. I don't think the sky is falling. I think we have made progress on a number of issues. I think we've made progress on the Second Amendment. I look back 30, 40 years ago, we have greater Second Amendment rights today than we did 30, 40 years ago. I think we've made some progress on the pro-life issue. I think we've made progress on freedoms to invest. It used to be you cannot own gold. And nobody remembers that anymore, but you may remember that, Mr. Chairman. At the time, it was illegal to own gold. Yeah. So we've got more freedoms overall, but there certainly are issues we need to address, and we need to strive harder. I don't think we're in a total disaster mode where we need to do the equivalent of going to Las Vegas and betting the farm on the roulette wheel. I don't think we're at that stage, and that usually doesn't work anyway.
Just a question, and thank you for that. But don't you think amending the Constitution is a better way to define the role of government?
I think specific amendments through the process that has been used multiple times, where we go through Congress, we get Congress to adopt an amendment and send it to the states. I think we have had some good amendments added that way. The Bill of Rights, the term limits on the president, those are excellent amendments. And I think that approach has worked, and that's what we need to continue to try harder to do, perhaps. Maybe an amendment, if you're going to ask me what amendment would I propose, an amendment to rein in the power of the federal courts would be good. But it would be a specific amendment so everybody knows what we're talking about and what we're voting on. It wouldn't be gathering a bunch of people together with vague instructions where they could rewrite the whole Constitution.
I'm going to ask you the same question as I asked the other two gentlemen that was able to ask. In 1976,
right,
the Pennsylvania General Assembly passed a resolution calling for a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution. What is your position on that amendment?
The balanced budget amendment, and I've spoken to my mother, late Phyllis Schlafly, many times about this too. There's some good things about it, and that we hope it would rein in spending. But I have to tell you, my mother, Phyllis Schlafly, had some misgivings about it too, in that it could enable Congress to justify raising taxes. So it could be a way, we've got Congress where they don't raise taxes anymore, and if they had a balanced budget amendment, they could then use that as a justification for raising taxes. They won't really cut spending. They'll say, well, we've got this deficit, now we've got to raise taxes and raise taxes and raise taxes. So candidly, I have some misgivings about whether that would really be good.
Okay, thank you. Your testimony talks about funding by dark money sources. Would you elaborate on what you mean by dark money, and do you have any recommendations to address the problems you have with the dark money?
I'm very much opposed to dark money. My mother was opposed to it too. And we've got a lot of billionaires running around, and they found a way to pump money into our political system without disclosing themselves as the sources. And this is not good. This is not healthy. It's distorting our political system. And I don't want to, my opponents have already spoken, so I'm not going to go off at length about that. I think I made my point about that. There needs to be transparency on money that flows in the system. And that's not just in the campaign process, but it's also in lobbying efforts like this. We need more transparency. So I think we're all in agreement about that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Do you have any thoughts on Senate Resolution 254 to limit campaign contributions and expenditures?
Personally, I think there needs to be a way to limit these billionaires' influence on our political process. That specific resolution, however, does call for a convention of states.
Okay.
So I'm opposed to that approach.
Okay.
I just think, because you can't limit it. You can't limit a convention of states.
Okay. Earlier this session, I proposed but did not formally introduce legislation to require 501c4s issue advocacy organizations to report names of their contributors, and I would appreciate any thoughts you may have on this proposal.
I would support that, and I'd like to help you with that.
I get a lot of pushback, dude.
I'm sorry?
I get so much pushback on that from what you would consider conservative organizations.
I think, unfortunately, some conservatives have been misled by this, and some are chasing the dark money. I hate to say it, but there's been some co-opting of people you would think are conservative by this dark money, and they don't want disclosure of their identities. But to me, transparency of who is influencing our political system is a healthy thing, and we need more of it, not less.
I asked this question to others too, and again, I'm gathering information. Right. If you take notice, Fred's writing down like crazy. We actually should be recording. But anyway, do you support any amendments to the U.S. Constitution? If yes, what types of amendments, and how do you recommend pursuing these changes?
Excellent question. And as I said earlier, I would support an amendment to rein in the federal courts and to limit their jurisdiction. Now, Congress can do this too. They can limit jurisdiction, but I'd put it right in the Constitution. But the process I would use is the process that's worked more than two dozen times already, which is Congress passing it by 2/3 majority in the House and Senate, and then going to the states for ratification. And then it would be specific to that issue and would not have this risk of repealing the Second Amendment and all these other things.
Got you. I'm sure I know the answer to this question also, but I have to ask it because, again, I'm trying to get all the input from me and from my colleagues as we would print them out and hand them to our fellow colleagues on the State Government Committee so we can be best informed. Anyway, during the 2016 presidential election, one of the candidates asked the question, what do you have to lose? Given where our country is today and where it appears to be headed, What do we have to lose by pursuing an Article 5 Convention of States? Your perspective, sir.
We do have a lot to lose, Mr. Chairman. We have fundamental freedoms in this country that perhaps we take for granted at this point, but we shouldn't. And I think if we step back and realize all the prosperity and liberties that we have that perhaps we don't appreciate enough, and realize that we could lose those and we could become like other countries. You don't even have a full right to free speech in many other countries, and we could lose this with an Article 5 convention. So respectfully, Mr. Chairman, while things could be better, I don't doubt that, and we could all of us could do more in getting engaged in government and making things better. I think there's a lot of things that we should appreciate and defend, and the Constitution's one of them.
Thank you for your answer. Lastly, what are your thoughts, if any, on a countermand amendment to the United States Constitution, which, if approved, would give states the ability to override federal legislation, executive orders, or court orders whenever 30 states take action to agree to such a veto?
I like it. I like it, Mr. Chairman. I think we agree on almost everything except the process. And that amendment should be done specifically through Congress so everybody knows what they're voting on, not through a convention of states.
Well, Mr. Shafley, thank you for your openness and candor. You're done too.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
To move things along, I'm going to ask the next section of gentlemen to come up, Mr. Eichenlaub and Mr. Valeriano. Please forgive me. Since you're from the same organization, we could maybe testify and then we can get to questions and such. Make sure your green light's on.
Okay.
And did I do your name justice, sir?
You were pretty close.
Pretty close?
Valeriano.
Valeriano.
Yeah.
Valeriano. Good name.
Did a good job.
Whoever wants to start first, the floor is yours. Make sure your light's on, summarize, and we'll rock and roll. Go ahead.
All right. I'll start. And first, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the committee for having a public hearing on Senate Resolution 254, and in particular by Senator Corman for inviting me, his constituent, to speak here today. First, let me tell you a little bit about me. I've lived in central Pennsylvania my entire life, and I do not come from a family of means. I knew poverty as a child, like many of the people around me, so I know well the problems that ordinary people face. Fortunately, like many of my friends and cousins, I've managed some degree of success. I got a degree from Penn State, Bachelor of Science, and I've worked in the software industry for nearly 30 years. When I was in grade school, I was taught that we have the greatest system of government in the world.
Mr. Eichenlaub,
Yes.
I'm sorry for interrupting you because I want to make sure you have full time. Could you summarize?
Sir, yeah.
If you could. I mean, I understand, and please do not be nervous. No one is, feel super comfortable. This is for information for my committee and for myself, and so please be comfortable.
Certainly.
Sure.
The remainder of my remarks will take less than 5 minutes, sir. Okay. So when I was in grade school, I was taught that we have the greatest system of government in the world, a representative democracy. I was told that that meant that every person, including me, had an equal say in what happens in our government. People tell the representatives what they want, and legislators draft and vote for legislation that best represents the interests of their constituents. If enough legislators vote for a bill, then that bill passes because it represents the will of the people. Now let's stop a minute and think about that. Is what I just described actually the kind of Congress we have today? It's extremely obvious to me that Congress no longer represents Americans like me who do not have the funds to influence politicians to represent their interests. The sheer size of campaign spending by unions, corporations, special interests, and dark money groups collectively ensures that most Americans have little or no influence on federally elected officials, compared to those big dog donors. We're no longer being heard by them. Senate Resolution 254, Free and Fair Elections, calls for a limited convention for proposing amendments under Article 5 of the United States Constitution. The purpose of such a convention would be to draft an amendment that would address the excessive influence that money has on our elections and restore our republic to the representative democracy that was originally intended. SR 254 is our most realistic path toward that change. Our Congress has demonstrated time and time again under both Democratic and Republican control that they do not view this as a problem worth solving. Fortunately, framers of the Constitution foresaw that Congress itself could be the problem. They included in Article 5 the means for the states to act on behalf of our citizens when Congress fails to do so on its own. While our nation has never hit the threshold of 2/3 of the states on a specific topic, pressure from state applications has played a critical role in motivating Congress to propose more than half of the constitutional amendments that our nation cherishes today, including the entire Bill of Rights. This is one of the most important constitutional rights, and it has been proven to be extremely effective. You'll note that the resolution does not specify what the amendment would say. Instead, it asks for a national conversation, a forum, where ideas from across the political spectrum, liberal and conservative, can be debated and judged on their merits. Further, when the amendment is proposed, the extremely high threshold of 38 states is necessary to ratify it, guaranteeing that the proposal not only be popular, but completely cross-partisan as well. This problem is fundamental enough that it requires a cross-partisan solution, and SR 254 represents the most cross-partisan way to solve it. The resolution has strong bipartisan legislative support. In the Senate, there are 28 co-sponsors consisting of 12 Republicans and 18 Democrats. The House version, HR 357, has 79 co-sponsors consisting of 48 Democrats and 31 Republicans. I've personally volunteered many hours and taken time off work to come to Harrisburg to ask you, our state representatives and senators, to vote on and pass this resolution. I do this because, to me, SR 254 addresses the single most important issue facing our country today. If we can fix just this one central problem, we can again face our nation's problems with an honest debate of ideas and a government that's incentivized to serve all of our citizens. And so, I ask you, once again, as one of your citizens, please vote yes on SR 254. Thank you.
Thank you. You're going to be next. Make sure your light's on, and if you can summarize.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you, Chairman, for having this hearing. I'm speaking on behalf of the all-volunteer group, PA United.
Is the green light on?
It is. Am I able to? Oh.
Yeah, maybe just pull a little closer. Yeah. Thank you very much.
All right. So I'm speaking on behalf of PA United to Amend. We're an all-volunteer group, all within Pennsylvania, all constituents of Pennsylvania as well. The reason I joined this organization is I immediately identified with the nonpartisan stance of PA United to Amend and the fact that we are using the Article 5 process to go around Congress. The underlying issue behind Congress's gridlock has been the massive influence of money in politics. The public no longer believes Congress is able to police themselves, and so it is up to the states to demand action to save our republic. The beauty in the Article 5 process is that it has such a high barrier to fruition. As such, the Article 5 process requires an issue that is wholly nonpartisan and easily understood by over 90% of the population. Take the Bill of Rights, for example. This is something that every average citizen could support, and both Virginia and New York called for an Article 5 convention on that limited topic. This call for an Article 5 convention was the impetus for a young Congress to jump in front of the movement and add the Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution. The Second Amendment was also supported by an Article 5 convention. People often concern themselves with the unknowns of an Article 5 convention for proposing amendments. However, more than 200 conventions for amending state constitutions have been held with few, if any, problems. We expect that admirable tradition to continue with an Article 5 convention because we rely on a representative democracy to keep our republic equally represented. That responsibility falls on the backs of our representatives to ensure that the limited convention stays to one topic and that the proposed amendment is tied to that limited convention topic. We've noted several reports, such as the report to the Attorney General in 1987 to the Department of Justice, the American Bar Association, and the Congressional Research Service, support the fact that Article 5 conventions can be limited to one topic. Our proud Commonwealth has a history of successfully using the Article 5 convention call. In February 13, 1901, Pennsylvania joined a coalition of states passing a convention call to directly elect U.S. senators. While the federal Senate at the time was seen as terribly corrupt and unwilling to change the system from which they benefited, once the 27 states applied for a convention on this topic, that limited topic, the federal Senate capitulated and proposed the amendment themselves. In 1979, the Pennsylvania responded to a perceived national need to amend the U.S. Constitution to prevent deficit spending by the federal government. Pennsylvania passed a convention call joining 31 states in calling for a balanced budget amendment, which you referred to earlier. According to the Congressional Research Service, this enormous statement by the states was ultimately what pushed Congress to pass the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act in 1985, which ultimately led to a balanced federal budget in the 1990s. Historically, when you need change from an unresponsive Congress, this is how you do it. I yield the rest of my time.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for summarizing. My questions are going to go back and forth, and actually you both can answer at the same time, too. I mean, not at the same time, but, you know, it'd be kind of cool, though.
Yeah.
You know,
well,
in stereo.
We do both work in software, so
right,
we're
exactly.
very identical minds. Yeah.
Since the introduction of Senate Resolution 2, and again, these are questions, and these questions are for information, and this information is to gather information so we can be best informed. So do not be offended by any of the questions, but I just believe in asking the questions so I can get the best answers, so I can get the best information, okay? So no one's picking on anybody here, just understand that, all right? Thank you very much. Since the introduction of Senate Resolution 254, I've asked you and other advocates two questions. How is the repeal of Citizens United not an infringement on the First Amendment right of freedom and speech? And secondly, why is so much of the emphasis, although Mr. Eichenlaub, thank you very much for including unions in your opening testimony, has been on corporations? So let's begin with the first question. How is limiting campaign contributions not an infringement on the First Amendment right of free speech? Anybody who just wants?
Sure. Well, go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, we're actually, with this, if this amendment, thank you. If this amendment, we're not talking about actually limiting free speech, we're actually enhancing it.
Okay.
I mean, for example, in this hearing, we have a limited amount of time to speak, and that's so that everyone can speak.
Exactly.
So that's my short answer to that.
Thank you. Sir.
Another answer to that would be that, you know, we're not calling for a removal of any kind of limits or a specific limit. Our resolution calls for the conversation to be had on that topic. Our resolution includes Citizens United because it's very much a hot topic issue of our time, and as such has created many loopholes for unions, corporations, and dark money to enter our political sphere.
Well, thank you for that answer. In its Citizens United decision, I'm going to go to the Supreme Court, right or wrong, so bear with me. And I quote, the censorship, this is from the U.S. Supreme Court, the censorship we now confront is vast in its reach. The government has muffled the voices that best represent the most significant segments of our economy. And the electorate has been deprived of information, knowledge, and opinion vital to its function. How do you respond to these concerns that overturning Citizens United will result in a renewed restrictions on First Amendment speech? I'm back to that again.
Sorry, could you repeat that last part?
Excuse me. How do you respond to these concerns from the U.S. Supreme Court that overturning Citizens United will result in renewed restrictions on the First Amendment right of free speech?
Any thoughts on that, Ron? I can't see it as our resolution would call for any restrictions on free speech.
Okay.
You know, I do not believe that any of our representatives or delegates that are brought to the Article 5 convention, should we get there, would want to limit free speech or would want to limit, the ability for the average person to donate money, as that has been considered free speech by that ruling.
I also think that if there was something in an amendment, if there was an amendment proposed that would severely limit free speech, it would never meet it would never be ratified by 38 states.
That's right.
You would only require 13 states to either say no or simply not act at all.
Well, but what I said was what the Supreme Court said. Well, and now, okay, that's a good point, Fred. Thank you.
Sure.
And I'll reread it. It says, the censorship we now confront is vast in its reach. This is from the Supreme Court concerning Citizens United. The government has muffled the voices that best represent the most significant segments of our economy, and the electorate has been deprived of information, knowledge, and opinion vital to its function, unquote. That came from the Supreme Court, right or wrong. And so that's where that came from. So, where was I going with that? I just had my brain. Right. The Supreme Court issued this because they saw it as an infringement, and that we've already had great reach, and that was part of their decision going forward. So, again, going back to the First Amendment and free speech, which this is all tied up into, that's how does that not affect that? I guess is my point.
So again, if I may interject, I would say that potentially the Citizens United ruling, and this is my personal views. This has nothing to do with Pennsylvania United to Amend or our resolution at all. We are only calling for that to be on a topic relating to it. But with that specific ruling, they ruled that corporations, unions, special interests, dark money have an unlimited ability of free speech, whereas citizens do not have they have a very specific limit. What is it, $2,300? That anyone can donate to a specific cause?
Excuse me? In Pennsylvania. That's true. I'm sorry, in Pennsylvania there are no limits.
Sure, yeah.
So, going forward, so.
But at least at the federal level, that still stands.
Sure.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether the citizens, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Regardless, did you have any more to say, sir? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Regardless, I'm looking at the time too. So anyway, regardless of whether repeal of Citizens United is or is not an infringement of the First Amendment freedom of speech, what would you think about an alternative approach? Rather than limiting campaign contributions, why not demand full disclosure of giving and political ads? I mean, total full disclosure, so that everybody knows, kind of like, I think it was the comedian Robin Williams that said that every politician should have to wear a jumpsuit from, NASCAR,
like NASCAR,
and they have all their sponsors on it, so so you know where everybody is and stands. And it was probably a pretty good analogy going forward. Mm-hmm. What do you think of that?
I think it's a wonderful idea. I think we really should know where these ads are coming from, and I think that's recently been proposed at the federal level. I believe President Trump had something to do with that.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are other good ideas as well at how to address the issue, and that would be the reason for having the convention, to debate and discuss those ideas.
Thank you very much. We've gotten written testimony and so forth, so as we were previewing through it all and looking at it all, I'm trying to include things in here so I can ask you guys questions. We got a written testimony submitted by, and I hope I pronounced her last name correctly because she's not here, or maybe she is, Lori Glode. She opposes Senate Resolution 254 because it is a step in eliminating free speech and private use of money in this country. Ms. Glode goes on to state that a number of organizations supporting SR 254 are funded by various outside donors. Has your organization received any money from outside interests to advance your efforts to pass SR 254?
As far as I know, I would say no. I was a personal I was a person who donated to the group we work with back when I was living outside the country.
Gotcha.
I found them online. I was very interested in what they did, and I wanted to support them from afar. It wasn't until I moved home that I actually volunteered and gave my time to work with them rather than donate money.
I don't need that. What would make this question here? What would your thoughts be on soft money contributions?
Could you define that a little bit more?
What would be a good definition of soft money? Okay.
If I may, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Leach is here.
First, I apologize for being late. It's our last day of session. There's a lot of bills that are sort of, their fate is hanging by a thread one way or another, and we're trying to negotiate some things, but I wanted to make a point of getting here. As I understand the question, soft money, hard money is money you give directly to a candidate, and whereas soft money is money you give to other entities, whether it's a party or a super PAC, to help that candidate, but that candidate themselves is not in charge of that money. So, if that's helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, it was.
You know, I think that's something that would definitely we would want to have addressed at the Article 5 convention. You know, I think it's easy to say that, oh, soft money isn't as bad as, I guess, hard money or dark money, but you know you're just creating another avenue for the money to get there. I mean, if you're going through a PAC or, you know, whatever, an LLC, whatever it may be, you know, it's just another way to fund whatever you want to fund. You know, so that, you know, that's my personal opinion, but we would want that to be discussed at the convention.
Yeah. There are plenty of good ideas out there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've heard of one where one possible restriction is to only allow money to come in to candidates from that district, and not from outside anywhere. No outside influences whatsoever.
I have a couple. And,
okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I believe the 2002 McCain-Feingold Act was the last major federal attempt to limit campaign contributions and was the focus of the Citizen United decision. During the passage of this law, Senator John McCain talked about the goal of limiting soft money. We just talked about that. If you cut off soft money, you're going to see a lot less attack advertising, prohibit unions, corporations from spending money on independent ads, and you will see a lot less of that. Do you agree or disagree with the late Senator McCain?
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And if you do agree, what are your recommendations for limiting the soft money political contributions?
Sure. So again, our resolution, we're not calling for anything specific. We mentioned several topics for which the convention, the Article 5 convention, can discuss, you know, to kind of lead them off. That is something that absolutely needs to be brought up and discussed, you know, within the confines of the convention, because soft money will affect a lot of these smaller, you know, election cycles and things like that, you know, local elections. You know, we're looking for something that really encompasses not only things at the federal level, but at the state and local levels as well.
Yes. I'm going to ask you questions and I had to correct something here. Forgive me. Earlier this session, I proposed, but I did not formally introduce, legislation to require 501c4 issue advocacy organizations to report the names of their contributors. I would appreciate any thoughts that you may have on this proposal.
Of my personal opinion, I would support it. As the group, I can't speak for them.
Yeah, I would echo that sentiment.
So do you think we should move forward with a formal introduction of such legislation?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Should we move forward with the formal introduction of such legislation?
Yeah.
Okay.
As a constituent of Pennsylvania, I support it.
Sure. What, if any, thoughts do you have on Senate Resolutions 133 and 134 calling for an Article 5 convention of states to impose fiscal restraints on federal government, limited federal powers, power and jurisdiction, establish congressional term limits, and strive for regulatory freedom?
Well, we fully support the method with which they are doing that, using Article 5 to call for a convention. As far as the specific proposals, I don't know if I have any particular opinions on them, but I think that if there are sufficient, if the amendments that come out of such a convention are sufficiently good that they would be ratified by 38 states, then I think that they would be fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
I
a pretty
agree with
high
that as
bar.
well. Yeah.
Okay. I am done with my questions, but I want to know Senator Leach for comments and questions, and thank you for coming.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I apologize for being all over the place this morning. And I also apologize in advance because I do not know what questions have been asked and what has not. So I may be asking questions you've already given eloquent and memorable answers to. I'm going to ask you to be a little patient with me in that regard.
Sure.
But I want to ask you, on the finance issue, I've introduced legislation on public financing of campaigns. I think that if we were starting from scratch and we were trying to devise a system, and someone raised their hand and said, "I think we should be able to take money from the people that we're voting to regulate or not regulate or whatever," everyone would say that's a crazy idea. However, our system has evolved in that direction, okay? And so if I am going to, if I'm going to vote on regulating, just to pick something, the chemical industry, and I got $10,000 from the chemical industry last election, I know that if I don't vote the right way from their perspective, I will not only not get the $10,000 next election, but my opponent will. And that is very troubling. And I have seen how this works close up. I mean, I've been in the caucus meetings where there was discussion about, well, we can't run this bill or that bill because this big donor or that big donor doesn't like it. I remember when I was a freshman in the House, there was a bill, suddenly it came on the floor to exempt car washes from sales tax. And I said to the guy next to me, I said, "What is this about?" I said, do we have a car wash crisis in Pennsylvania? Are we having trouble attracting car washes? And they said, no, the prime sponsor is a big car wash owner, owns a bunch of car washes in his district, and it's, he's a big donor to him, so he's doing a favor. And so fortunately that bill didn't get across the finish line. But it illustrates the problem with this. And people say, why should the taxpayers have to pay for politicians' campaigns? And I always say, I promise you will save far more money than you pay on subsidies and tax breaks and other things that we don't pass if we don't feel obligated. And, to be honest with you, it's very difficult because I have faced the need to raise money as a guy who runs for office from time to time. And, if there's a person on the line, if there's two calls on the line and one is from a $5,000, $10,000 donor or whatever, and one is from someone who's never given a check before, I like to think I'm going to, not let that enter my thought process. But as a human being, we can only be saintly so long. So, it's not really it's not an issue of people, it's an issue of a system. So I think we should take money out of politics entirely. However, we would have to change. We'd have to. No, please. Please, you don't have to apply. You can, write a check. No, I'm kidding. But, given the current jurisprudence at the Supreme Court, that even if we could pass a bill like that, it wouldn't be upheld. And originally I thought, well, the best way to go about changing it is to change the Supreme Court, but that hasn't worked out as I'd hoped. So, so I want to talk to you a little about the convention as a concept, and then what we would specifically do with public finance and campaign finance, and what kind of system you'd like to see. First on the convention, and I imagine you've been asked about this because it's sort of an obvious question. It's something I spent a great deal of time thinking about, and I've read a lot about, and I've read arguments on both sides at length. But, the Articles of Confederation were going to be tweaked. That was a convention. And then, lo and behold, a whole new constitution came out of it. All right? And how do we prevent that? I mean, the concern is that you can't limit what a constitutional convention can do. Because, and some of the scholars say, if a constitutional convention can pass anything it wants, and if it's ratified, that is sort of de facto or after the fact acceptance of what they did. So you can't say that they went beyond the rails, and so forth. Is there any way? Because I'm very concerned. We go into let's say we have a constitutional convention to address Citizens United and campaign finance. And then all of a sudden, there's amendments on abortion and guns and, 100 other issues that people on both sides or all sides have wish lists. There's some constitutional changes I would like to make if I had dictatorial power. Can you give me some sense of how confident you are that if we wanted to have a convention, that we could limit it to a specific set of things, and what would be the enforcement mechanism if the Constitution, if like let's say we were in either a statute or in the documents calling for the convention, we said we're limiting it to this, but everyone shows up in, let's say, Philadelphia, and they're like, you know what, we have some other things we want to do. Once they do that, what's the enforcement mechanism, and who does that? And any enlightenment you can give me on this, because that is the biggest impediment to me supporting a constitutional convention, which is, I don't know I'm not sure that I know where it's going, and there's some scary places it could go in my view. So anyway.
There are at least 4 methods of enforcement. One is that Congress itself plays a role in this, and that they wouldn't want the convention to have more power than they have, and they could set the ground rules for the convention, and that it be limited to a specific topic. Secondly, delegates could be recalled. I mean, they do have they would be bound by the individual states' legislatures to discuss only the topic that was in the convention. And they could possibly face penalties if they violated those rules. And there's also, if the ground rules are set that it's only limited to that one topic, then it could be shut down immediately. In other words, somebody could say this is out of order. We're not going there, so and shut that down. The third is there could be pursuit in the courts. If the convention really did get off topic, it went crazy anyway, right? The legislatures have passed a resolution that's asked that the convention be limited to a specific topic, and if they go off topic, then there's pursuit in the courts. Fourth way, ultimately, let's say that it really does go off the rails and they propose all kinds of crazy things and repeal that amendment, this amendment. 38 states have to ratify that. Only 13 have to sit out on any particular amendment for it not to become one.
Let me ask you so I understand Congress could write something. That sets a parameter. That's not really an enforcement mechanism. The second thing you said was more of an enforcement mechanism. They could be recalled. Would that be by the voters or the state legislature? Who would recall delegates who? So
the states would choose the delegates, correct? So if they're able to choose them, they also would be able to recall them.
Again, that's the state legislature that would do that?
Yeah.
My concern is that both the state legislature liked what they were doing.
Do you think that both groups in the state legislature would be for?
Well, I assume to recall them, you'd have to get a majority vote to recall them. Yeah. So let's say, hypothetically, I'll put the onus on me. Let's say the Democrats are in control in a state, right? and they pass they said, we're going beyond campaign finance. We're going to guarantee everyone a base wage. Everyone in America has a base wage, all right? Someone goes and says, well, wait a minute, that's beyond what the parameters of this is. State legislator, you've got to do something about this. I'm like, well, yeah, but I'm for that. I'm voting no on recalling them. My concern is at the end of this process, as we've learned in many cases, and no matter where you stand on it, but there have been a lot of things in, like, whether it was Bush versus Gore or other things, at the end of the process, there are always human beings, all right? And human beings tend to do, and we've seen this so much recently, we've become so tribal and so partisan. Human beings tend to do, they find a way to justify things that are happening that they like, even if A, they're not really in comportment with what we've historically considered to be the rules, and B, even if they were mechanisms that they themselves hadn't condemned in the past. Suddenly, when it's your guys doing it, suddenly, it makes some sense. I'm a little worried about that, and I understand there is no magic answer. At the end of the day, we may have to just take a leap of faith or something, and hope that people are responsible.
If I may, Senator, what you're describing currently is Congress. You're describing a body. Yeah, you're describing a body or a group of people that are potentially bought or beholden to their own interests, and that refuse to work together on a broad topic, and that already exists.
No, you're right.
Yeah,
but look at it. Let me just give you an example, and I know Mike may disagree with me, but Mike and I are good friends, and we tease each other from time to time. Oh yeah, because I'm better at it. But anyway. From my perspective, knowing others may disagree, we had a protocol for Supreme Court justices getting votes, right, for 200 some years. The average time between a nomination and a confirmation was about 70 days, historically. Then we had Merrick Garland, who was nominated over 300 days before the end of the term, and Senator McConnell said, well, no more nominations, no more confirmations in an election year, even though like Anthony Kennedy was and Benjamin Cardozo was, but putting that aside, no more of that. We're not doing that anymore. The voters should have a right. Okay, that's the new rule. And then last week he was asked, well, suppose President Trump has a nominee in 2020. I assume you won't bring him to the floor. Well, I never said that. That's a different story. And of course, we know what that is. It's like if it's someone I like, they get a vote. If it's someone I don't like, they don't get a vote. And, I'm just concerned that if that is the protocol on constitutional conventions, we'll have the same result, which is like the people in power will be able to, do whatever they want. I don't know how we stop that. I've read a lot. I'm trying to think of a method. Knowing the history of the Articles of Confederation, there is precedent for that, metastasis of the convention. So I'm struggling with it. If I could be convinced we could limit it to something, and maybe that's something we should have a working group on or something to try to think of actual limits that are enforceable in a way that is not dependent on the enforcers being unhappy with the result.
Sure. Yeah,
okay.
I understand those concerns, Senator. That's why, I had mentioned earlier, we have had over 200 conventions at the state level, and they have not gone already. We've had, multiple groups at the federal and large groups such as the American Bar Association's report to an Attorney General Department of Justice. We have Congressional Research Service. They all confirm that an Article 5 convention can be limited to one topic.
Or two, or whatever.
Well, one. No, they specifically say limited to one topic. That's what they say in their
reports. Could we do it to two?
I mean,
or three, or like a series of topics. I mean, could we agree that there's a certain area of law we want to look at? Elections. Mm-hmm. So there may be a campaign finance component. Mm-hmm. There may be a voters' Bill of Rights component.
Yes, it's a topic. Yeah.
Okay.
They're selecting the one topic, and it may be broad. That's certainly possible.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree that it would be completely unfortunate if we invested all this time and we actually had a convention, and then this came to pass, that there were special interests that ended up controlling everything. It would end up being a complete waste of time, because that convention
It'd be worse than a waste of time.
convention, it would be worse than a waste of time, but that convention can only propose, right? So no matter what they come up with, it has to be ratified. Congress itself, every day they meet, they could possibly have a runaway and propose any wild thing. They've proposed over 11,000 amendments to the Constitution.
Wow.
Yes.
Well, final question, and which is that, let's assume that happens. Given politics today, do you think, and especially, I find there's nothing more political around here than politics, which sounds, that's the sort of insight my constituents have come to expect. But in other words, when we vote on bills that will potentially affect the outcome of elections, we don't get more party line than that in terms of the votes, right? And given that this Citizens United campaign finance goes to the heart of who can and can't win elections, do you think that we can get 38 states to ratify any proposal? Because any proposal, it seems like, would benefit one side or the other, even if that's not the intent, just the fact of it. I mean, you know, the Citizens United will make it harder for big money interests, which certain people would think, well, that's not going to help me. I rely on big money interests.
Well,
given that partisan divide, do you think we can get 38 states to ratify something?
I absolutely believe so. This is an issue that over 90% of the population point to as the underlying issue of gridlock and of all of our underlying problems throughout our country. You know, this is special interest money. All the different potential sources of money in politics is causing an underlying rift everywhere across the country. We see it at the federal level, state, local, everywhere you go. You know,
the delegates would have to keep in mind that they have that high bar of 38 states. So anything that they come up with would absolutely have to be a cross-partisan amendment.
Yeah, there's a reason the Bill of Rights passed so easily. You know, back when there was only 13 colonies, 13 states. You know, only 2 states proposed an Article 5 convention on the Bill of Rights as a topic, and yet Congress still pushed it through themselves before it even got to the two-thirds threshold. It's because this topic is so needed by the country, and this one specifically follows that same route. So many people know it's an underlying issue on both sides. It's a nonpartisan issue. Everyone at all levels believes it, mentions it, talks about it, and yet we still haven't gotten anywhere with it.
No, I like to think you're right. I would say when the Bill of Rights was passed, we did not yet have political parties. See, that's the thing. I mean, that's the whole thing. The Electoral
People
College
that disagree, that's all it really is.
No, but I mean, but it's more than disagreement, because I think I disagree slightly, because I feel like people are willing to support things they don't agree with now if their team supports it. And, you know, George Washington warned about partisanship, and there were no political parties back then in the very beginning. For example, the Electoral College was, you know, a legitimate effort to elect wise men, at the time it was just men, to go down and deliberate and pick a reasonable president. But once there were parties with slates that were committed to vote for the winner, you know, for the candidate of their party, the whole purpose of the Electoral College went away. Okay, then it was just counting the votes. And now, if you dare deliberate, you're actually and vote for someone other than your party, you're called a faithless elector. And so, I feel like it may be a different time than it was back then. But maybe, you know, look, I've been wrong before. I know it's hard to.
Well, I do appreciate the fact that you are a prime co-sponsor on Senate Resolution 254.
I would like to move things forward, but I'm just I struggle with myself a lot, which is creates. This is why I don't sleep. All right, so
I understand.
Anyway, thank you.
I would point back to what Chairman Fulmer spoke about earlier. Einstein's theory, doing the same thing over and over again, is insanity. That's where we are right now. We can point to all of the partisanship we see every day, and yet if we don't do something different than what we're doing today, then what are we doing talking about it? It's not going to get us anywhere. So I think this resolution really points to a solution that we might be able to get something done with.
I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Leach, and thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Senator.
In closing, the debate on the role of the federal government has been raging since the 39 of the 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention signed in the document in 1787. 3 delegates refused to sign because they considered it a flawed document. In the state ratification debates that followed, these 3 were joined by a host of other anti-federalists who also opposed ratification, including Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, James Monroe, Richard Henry Lee, and George Mason, who, by the way, is the author of Article 5, but that's aside. The Federalists were rallied by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, who authored the series of 85 articles in support of the proposed Constitution known as the Federalist Papers. Ultimately, the proposed Constitution was ratified by 13 original states and 37 additional states throughout the 231 intervening years. And it included Article 5, and I quote, "The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments." Today, we've heard arguments both for and against moving forward with an Article 5 Convention of States. This obviously won't be the end of this discussion. However, I will continue to agree with George Washington. If we fail to file the Constitution, it becomes mere words on paper. So when we adhere to the Constitution and amend it rather than interpret it, it remains the rule of law. This concludes today's hearing, and thank you very much for joining here, and thank you folks for all being here. It seems like, before we close, I think there's a lot of folks in this room that probably agree on a lot of things here today. And the bottom line is the purpose of this hearing and the purpose of the good questions and so forth was to get information, to make us best informed as we can go forward. So thank you very much for being here today.